Well, hello everyone, thanks for tuning in to this week's video where today I am finally getting around to editing all of your photos. So I put out a newsletter a few weeks ago asking you guys to send in your submissions, and you definitely didn't disappoint. Thank you to everybody who sent in a photo, and I'm really looking forward to sharing your work. So how this is going to work is I'm going to break this up into two videos. It's not done in any particular order, there's no favoritism here. I've just done a variety of photos for this video, and I'll do another selection for the next video, and everyone who submitted will be featured. So like I said, this was done as a call to action through my newsletter, so if you want to participate on the channel, there'll be future opportunities where you can get involved, and the best way to be kept up to date on all of those things is to subscribe to the newsletter, which you can do in the description just by following the link. If you sign up, you do get a free Lightroom preset as well, and I will be using Lightroom today to edit all of the photos, but I'm not actually going to use any presets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each photo, as it comes. I'm going to start the process, start to finish, and I'm going to give some tips around composition, how I would approach editing these photos, and just give a few pointers of what I would think about if I was in the field capturing that image. So this is all very subjective. If I, express any opinions, then it's not meant to be a criticism. It's nothing negative, certainly nothing personal. It's all designed to be very constructive, because at the end of the day, photography is art and art is subjective. My editing style might not necessarily be your editing preference. That's just the way that photography goes. So just keep that in mind as we go through these photos, and I think we'll all have a great time. The most important thing is to create a nice kind of friendly environment to do this. So even down in the comments, just everyone be nice to everyone. That is all I ask. So without further ado, let's get into Lightroom and take a look at your photos. Our first submission today is from Claus Rasmussen. So Claus, thank you so much for sending in this beautiful atmospheric image. So Claus is from Denmark, and the information that he sent in with this photo, which I'll just read out to you now, he says, I went out for an early morning walk in my local area to scout out a woodland and to see if the spring colours were starting to appear. The woods were still green, but lucky for me it was a misty day with golden hour sunshine, and it was amazing. And I completely agree, these conditions are absolutely beautiful for shooting in. He shot this on a Sony a6700 with a Sony 70-350G lens handheld. So let's take a look at this image. So as I mentioned, absolutely beautiful shot, Claus. I think the first thing to have a look at here is just the kind of framing and the sort of composition, because we really want to focus in on a particular subject. Now, when you have misty conditions like this, conditions in themselves can make for great subjects, but here you've got a lovely sort of collection of trees on the sort of distant shore, and those are reflected quite nicely in the lake. And where you have these kind of like dead trees, some of the texture in the clouds appear, I think that they maybe distract slightly from this particular photo. So what I'm going to do is just crop this simply. I'm going to sort of do this freehand just to kind of show the type of framing that I would probably go for. But what you might want to do to kind of achieve this kind of like letterbox crop, you might want to shoot this as a pano. So what you would do is have your camera in sort of vertical orientation with this kind of field of view, and just take a series of shots, and then you can stitch them together in Lightroom, and that will give you a higher resolution image. I've cropped this in quite significantly, so we are going to lose a bit of definition there. But really with this shot, now that I've isolated the subject, I'm just going to think about the tonality really. So in terms of the color temperature, I think you've got it pretty nailed on in camera. I might make it just a little bit warmer, and I'm going to increase the exposure a little bit just to sort of brighten up the scene. Highlights I'll bring down ever so slightly, shadows bring down ever so slightly. And I think I'm really going to use the curves here more so than this kind of basic adjustment panel. So with the clarity, I am going to reduce that. I think for these kind of like misty shots where you've got quite an atmospheric scene, I think reducing clarity, reducing the dehaze, reducing the texture a little bit, I think just adds, to that ethereal kind of feel. Here with the tone curve, I'm just going to do some basic points here. I'm going to drop the black, so like the shadows, because what that is going to do is it's going to bring out some of the definition and contrast in the trees, just to kind of make those pop a little bit more. I don't want anything to kind of be true black in this image, so I am going to lift up the extreme of the shadows here, just to make sure that anything that is black is sort of a bit softer, a bit more cinematic looking. I'm also just going to bring down the contrast in the sort of upper mid-tones and highlights, something like that. Next, before we look at colour, I am just going to tidy up some of this foreground as well. So, you know, you can take your time doing this in Photoshop and stuff if you want to, but, you know, I'll just do it sort of fairly quickly here. Something like that. And now we can start to look at the colours. So you can have a lot of fun with this, but I feel like in scenes like this where there aren't really any sort of like truly defined colours, you know, it's like the trees don't have any colour and there's a tonality from the sky and from the mist, but really, you know, if you were going to look at isolating and manipulating individual colours, you know, it's not going to necessarily create a great effect. So here in this type of scene, I'd be looking to use split toning more so than anything else. So like you mentioned, this was sort of like a sunrise shot, so you have some warmth from the sun, but you also have, you know, some cooler tones of that, you know, cloudy, misty weather, and I probably just want to accentuate that a little bit in the split toning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some warmth to the shadows, just because I feel like that creates just a general warm image. You know, there's probably more shadow information in this image than there are highlights, for example. So I'm just going to bring in some warmth. I'm going to contrast that by adding some cooler tones into the highlights, maybe some warm tones into the mid-tones as well. Kind of something like that. What I might want to do is just refine the crop a little bit further. So what I tend to do is I'll kind of get the image looking how I want it, but then I'll always just sort of see if my opinion and my feeling for the image has changed as I've edited it, you know, further. So here I think there's just a bit too much negative space on this side, so I might just want to crop that in. I still want things to have room to breathe in this image, so, you know, I'm going to make sure that there's plenty of room around the outside for, you know, the reflections and for the trees. But I think something like that works pretty nicely. So, you know, nothing sort of too drastic, just slightly stylized. So Claus, I hope you enjoyed that edit. Great photo, really nicely exposed, you know, white balance was perfect, so didn't need an awful lot of work, but really just thinking about the tonality, I think for these types of shots always works really well. So this next image that we have is from Greg Howard. Greg is also known as Distant Media here on YouTube. You may have seen his channel. If you haven't, make sure to go and check it out using the link in the description. Go and give him a subscribe. He's a brilliant photographer, and he has sent in this sort of street photography type photo, which he knows is not necessarily, you know, my sort of forte in terms of photography. You know, I tend to shoot more landscapes, but I enjoyed the challenge. So Greg has submitted this image, and along with that he has given a bit of a description. So he says that he was in Newcastle upon Tyne, which is a city in the northeast of England, and he shot this with a Sony A7 IV with a 50mm lens. He says, my brother was visiting and we decided to aimlessly wander around the town, both using a budget 50mm to see what each other noticed, having very different eyes. I think that's always a great exercise, isn't it, of just sort of, you know, restricting yourself to one focal length and just kind of seeing what catches your attention at that particular field of view. And he sent in a few photos, but I really like this one because for me this immediately just kind of screams cinematic to me. You know, we've got this great subject here, really nicely exposed with the negative space caused by the shadow, and, you know, having the subject isolated and silhouetted here, and having the sort of city backdrop in the background. So first thing I'm going to do in this photo, Greg, is I'm just going to apply a bit of a cinematic 16:9 crop. I still want the subject to sort of be this person walking down the steps, and I still want to have plenty of sort of negative space around this subject just to kind of frame it nicely. So I'll probably go in a bit tighter, something like that. So what I'm going to do first of all is just drop the highlights just to kind of bring out a bit of definition in the background. I'm going to drop the shadows even more just to kind of further create that silhouetted look, because really bringing out detail in this area isn't really going to do very much for the photo. I'll probably reduce the blacks here a little bit as well, but what I'll do is again create that tone curve because with it being a sort of cinematic feel, I do want to increase the bottom here just to kind of soften those blacks. And I'm just going to reduce the contrast. Creates a slightly flatter profile, which I think is just a bit more cinematic. I probably warmed this image up a little bit as well. Something like that looks pretty good. Now let's have some fun with the colors. So here, what I want to do is I want to create that cinematic look, as I mentioned. So I think really when you've got blue sky like that, I think with some of these kind of reddier hues in the buildings, I think that sort of like orange and teal is probably a way to go, but I'm going to be a bit more original than that because I think orange and teal is slightly overdone at this point. So I'm just going to make the yellows slightly more orange. I'm just going to reduce the greens. I'm going to reduce the saturation of the blues a little bit and the aquas, and I'm going to increase the saturation of the orange. And with the split toning, again, I'm going to sort of apply a pretty generous color grade on this to create that cinematic feel. So with this, I always think if you've got that orange and teal look, typically you would put cooler tones into the shadows and warmer tones into the highlights. But when you've got blue sky days, I'm imagining this was shot at, you know, sort of late morning, you know, early afternoon. It's not golden hour basically. So I feel like adding warm tones to a blue sky just doesn't really work very well because middle of the day light is not typically very warm. So I'm going to invert that and I'm going to do a pretty warm shadow area, something like that. And for the sky, I'm going to add slightly cooler tones, maybe something like that. And then the same for the mid-tones, and we'll just refine this a little bit as we go. I'm going to add some grain as well, just because, you know, I like that when I'm going for that cinematic feel. You know, having a bit of grain in your image is never a bad thing. And yeah, I would probably leave it there. So, you know, before and after, really there's not an awful lot to do. It was just cropping it slightly and just thinking about how to stylize it to kind of create that feel. So, Greg, hope you enjoyed this edit. Let me know down in the comments. So next we have Glynn Hodson. Glynn, thanks so much for sending this one in. Glynn has taken a photo of a favourite subject of mine. This is South Stack Lighthouse on the island of Anglesey. And let's see what Glynn has to say about this image. So he says, as you can probably tell, this was shot at the famous South Stack Lighthouse in Anglesey. Me and my friend went to North Wales for a full day of shooting, and the plan was to end up at South Stack, where we got super lucky with the weather, which gave us some amazing sunsets at the end of the day. Yeah, conditions looked absolutely spot on for this one. He shot this on a Sony a7 IV with a 24-105 f4 lens. He says regarding the image, he loves the birds flying through the horizon, which adds a bit of interest and action to that part of the frame. He says he thinks some clouds in the distance would have been a bonus just to add a bit of texture, and maybe could have put my aperture at maybe 5.6 or higher to possibly get more foreground in focus. So yeah, we'll have a look at some of these compositional things as we go through this image. But firstly, I just want to say how great of an image this is. What I want to do first of all is just reduce the highlights just to see what we've got to work with here. So yeah, this is nicely exposed. We've still got some color in the sky that we can bring out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the exposure, drop the highlights, increase the shadows a little bit, just get to like a nice sort of neutral starting point. And let's have a look at the crop. So yeah, I think if you'd shot it a little bit wider, you might have gotten away with having a bit more of an accentuated leading line, but I think, you know, with that 24mm lens, you know, you might not be able to get super wide. I've shot at this location before, and it really does benefit from some, you know, wide angle field of view. But I think the way that you've shot this at around 35mm, you know, the lighthouse, which I do think is the subject of, you know, compositions around here, you've got that nicely sort of censored and it's got good visual weight. What I'd be inclined to do is kind of crop in a little bit from the right hand side, only because when we're talking about visual weight, my eye is kind of drawn to this part of the image, which I don't really want it to be. I want my eye to be drawn to the center because that is you know, where the kind of action is, I suppose. You've got this nice lead in here as well of the wall coming from the left-hand side, and you've got the railing from the right-hand side, so those converging lines, I think there is probably about right. I'll just check that the horizon is straight. So yeah, that's all good. And I want to talk about the birds slightly, because I absolutely agree with coastal imagery. Having sort of birds in there can be, you know, real great points of interest. I think for me in this image, because the birds are flying out of the frame, for me it feels like my eye is being drawn out of the frame as well. I don't know how much you enjoy Photoshop in terms of, you know, your imagery, but if you maybe flip those birds around so they were flying the other way, I feel like compositionally that might be slightly more pleasing, and it would sort of draw the eye back into the centre. So, you know, don't hate me for this, Glynn, but I might actually clone out those birds, just because I think that will actually clean the image up slightly, and it will really sort of focus on the lighthouse being the main subject. And then really the only other thing that I would sort of do in this image is just look at the sort of tonality and the colours, because you've got a really nice white balance in this image. So because it's kind of sunset going into blue hour, I suppose, I'd probably just want to sort of accentuate those colours. So what I'm going to do is, using the split toning here, I'm going to add some bluey, purpley sort of tones into the shadows. I'm going to add some warmer tones into the highlights just to kind of bring out the sunset. And into the mid-tones, I'm just going to add some, again, some sort of bluey purples, because that seems to be impacting the water. So I want there to be like sort of cohesion between, you know, tonality. I don't want the sea to look an unnatural colour, basically. But yeah, that's pretty much about it. It's a great image, Glynn. Thanks so much for sending this in. I'll just do a quick before and after. So, you know, nothing drastic, just again, thinking about what I want the the sort of subject to be in the focal point, which is the lighthouse, and just making sure that my eye isn't being drawn and distracted by, you know, other elements. So Glynn, great photo. All of Glynn's information will be down in the description. He also has a great YouTube channel, so be sure to check that out. So this next image is from Max Munton. Thanks for sending this in, Max. Max says that this photo was taken in the Peak District, taken it in October, near the summit of Munton. It's an area that I have been to before, actually. This is a great view. I love the sort of road sweeping through this shot. This was shot on a Leica M11P with a 40mm Summicron lens metered for the highlights. Yeah, this is a really nicely exposed photo. Max is from North Yorkshire. I actually follow Max on Instagram. Love his photography, so be sure to go and check out his work. So I think for this photo, what I'm going to do is do quite a lot of local adjustments, because I feel like anywhere where you have a lot of contrast caused by dapple light, whether that's kind of like, you know, some highlights and then some areas in shadow, I think rather than sort of editing globally, it really benefits from being a bit more selective and doing some, you know, dodging and burning, really, for lack of a better term. So let's first just have a look at the framing here. So I'm just going to crop in from the edges, because I feel like the road needs to sort of be front and center. So I just want there to kind of be equal distance from this kind of bend in the road to this bend in the road. And because there's not an awful lot going on in the sky, I'm not too bothered about losing some of that, just because I want where the road ends to kind of be the center of the frame, because then the upper third is just the vista in the background, which is a really beautiful view. So probably something like that. I'm going to just warm up the image slightly, and I'll do just some basic adjustments just to kind of get us in the ballpark, and then we'll do some local adjustments just to kind of tune things further. So we'll just do this super quick for now. Again, I'm just going to add in my preference for a tone curve. So nice punchy shadows, but not true black, and a slightly lower contrast in the highlights. I just quite like images that are quite soft in the highlights, but still have nice definition in the shadows. For this image, I'm just going to go down to the calibration, because I want to see if I can get a bit more separation between some of these colours. So you've got your red, green and blue primaries here, and sometimes it's nice to just sort of tweak these. You know, all cameras are different in terms of how sensors render colour. I always find when you have a lot of green and a lot of sort of warm tones, that reducing the blue primary actually makes the oranges slightly more orange, and it creates more separation between sort of oranges and greens. But something like that I think will work pretty nicely. I'm also going to reduce the saturation of the greens slightly. So let's do some local adjustments. So here, quite simply, I want the road to be the sort of main focal point, I suppose. So I'm just going to add a brush here. I'm doing this fairly roughly, but you'll get the idea. And I'm just going to literally just increase the exposure of that, just so it pops a little bit more. And then I'm going to contrast that by just brushing the shadows here. So anywhere in the image where there are, you know, true shadows, where there isn't really any sunlight, I'm just going to start masking those a little bit. That should hopefully make the road stand out a bit more. And then what I'm going to do is add another brush and do the same for the highlights, but I'm going to make the highlights a little bit brighter. Maybe just warm those up a little bit as well. So that's pretty nice. In terms of the color grading here, again, I'm just going to add in some cooler tones to the shadows, some warmer tones to the highlights. So pretty much something like that. I wouldn't do too much more than that, really. I just think it's a great image. You've got the lead in line, which looks absolutely great, and I think visual weight wise, you know, you've got the road as the sort of bottom half of the image and the sky as the top half, and it's just kind of accentuating that, and, you know, just thinking about the tonality, really. So great image. Max absolutely loved that one. So this next image is from Ferguson. Thanks so much for sending in your submission. This was shot on the Wirral. He says, I'm lucky to cycle past this place most days on my way to work, and Port Sunlight is such a great place to be with the camera throughout the year, particularly in spring and autumn with low light. Shot on the Sony a7R5 with a Sony 50mm f2.5G. Great camera, great location as well. My girlfriend's family actually are from that sort of area. What I'm going to do first of all is just crop this a little bit. So just do a 4x5, because there's not really too much going on in the top half, and I think you've got more detail in the bottom half of this image. So maybe something like that. Just going to straighten it a bit to make sure that the church is nice and straight. Just going to warm it up slightly. So thankfully there's plenty of dynamic range at hand here, so I'm just going to increase the shadows ever so slightly, drop the highlights, going to reduce the whites, increase the blacks. Again, just add a fairly simple tone curve. And here I'm just going to mess around with the colours, I think. So with the yellows, I'm going to move those slightly more towards orange. I'm going to desaturate the greens, and I'm going to desaturate the yellows a little bit as well. And I'm actually just going to increase the shadows a little bit more, just to get a tiny bit more definition, especially down here, you know, where you've got the bridge. That bridge is like a nice leading line into the frame, so, you know, I want to make sure that that is nicely in shot. This time I'm going to add some warm tones to the shadows. Again, like with that blue sky, you know, because this is slightly more golden light, I am going to add a little bit of warmth into the highlights, but I'll counteract that with some cooler tones in the mid-tones where we've got, you know, this kind of part of the image here. So maybe something like that, I think looks quite nice. I am just going to add a brush just to bring out some of the definition in this tree. I'll warm that up a little bit as well. And I think I am going to add a bit of grain to this photo because, again, it looks quite filmic. What I might do actually is just reduce the blues a little bit. Yeah, that's a bit nicer. So yeah, before and after. A fairly simple edit really, but I just don't think it needs any more than that. You know, the subject is really nice, and if you've got a great subject, then sometimes the edit, you know, doesn't need to be too over the top. And then finally we have this image from Gareth Williamson of this beautiful nuthatch, I believe it is. A great bird. You don't see too many of them. They're quite hard to spot, but I absolutely love the colour in their plumage with the sort of blues and the orange. A nice aesthetically pleasing bird. So let's see what Gareth has to say about this particular photo. So he's attached the raw file and he says, this isn't anything special, it was full auto with an A6100. Now, I disagree, I think this is a great image. He says, I'm very much new to the craft, but I find it fun to just find opportunities to shoot currently, which is great. You know, I hope you're enjoying photography, and if you're new to the craft, then this is a great photo. All I would do here is just think about composition. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to crop this in. I kind of want the bird to be a little bit more centered in the frame, but I think what you've done really well here, Gareth, is you've got the bird facing into the image, which compositionally I think is great, and thankfully there's lots of negative space for the bird to look into, so making sure that there is plenty of negative space. And you can see here that the bird is kind of on this third line, so I would leave it at that. And what you can do to further accentuate the subject is maybe just draw a bit of a linear gradient here and darken it, just so you can help the eye draw back to the center. Let's just quickly look at the white balance. So I'm just going to adjust this slightly. I'm going to reduce the highlights, increase the shadows, add a bit of contrast, and just do a simple tone curve. I'll just up the blacks as well to soften those slightly, and really I think the only thing that I would do here is just have a look at the colors. So the green in the background, I think we can probably reduce that slightly. It sort of maybe distracts slightly from the color palette of the bird, and then what we can do is we can increase the oranges and increase the blues just to help, I suppose, bring out the color of the plumage, which I think is a great aspect of this particular subject. And then really just have a look at some color grading. So again, with those orange and blue tones, I'll probably just want to accentuate those in this image. So yeah, add some warmth to the highlights and shadows, and maybe some blue tones to the mid-tones, something like that. You know, fairly straightforward. It's just kind of making sure that the bird is the focal point, and trying to match the other colours to that tonality, and I think you can't go far wrong. So Gareth, thank you for sending this in. Absolutely fantastic image, and keep at it with the photography. You know, wildlife is a tricky thing to photograph, so you know, great job on catching this photo of a fairly elusive bird. I don't see too many of them around here, so yeah, great job. So there we have it, guys. Thank you so much for everyone who submitted a photo. I will be doing another round of edits over the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on the next video where I'll be featuring more of your work. If you enjoyed this one, give the video a thumbs up, let me know what you think of the edits down in the comments, and please be kind to the photographers featured. You know, photography is very subjective, and if you don't like any of the photos, any of the edits, then, you know, just try and be constructive and, you know, don't be too critical. This is all just designed to be a bit of fun. So thank you to everyone who submitted. It takes a lot of courage to submit your photography to be, you know, shown online, so I appreciate that, and I will see you all next week for another video.